Australia's growing dependence on imports is exposing critical weaknesses in its manufacturing base. With me today is Aleks Lajovic, MD of Impact International, who argues that without long-term policy support and a shift in perception, the nation risks losing sovereign capability in essential sectors such as plastics and packaging. Aleks, you've written a pretty stark warning about Australia's manufacturing trajectory. What prompted you to speak out now?
Good afternoon, Lindy, and thank you for talking with us. I'm coming really from a position of concern and also, to a certain extent, frustration. The 2020 COVID pandemic really highlighted some structural weaknesses that we had as a manufacturing producer and as a packaging producing country. And when I look to where we are today, we're in a worse position than what we were back then. In the last 2 years, we've had numerous suppliers close. We've lost so much depth of knowledge in our industry, and it sort of brings you to a point where this war in the Middle East, or as we're calling it from a supply chain perspective, COVID 2.0, is bringing up all the points that we should have learned from back in COVID-19 times, 2020 to 2023. And it feels like we haven't heeded those lessons. And that's causing us to feel a sense of frustration with the situation that we find ourselves in, because it didn't have to be this way.
So let's look at it, why this matters now most urgently. What are you seeing across the plastics and packaging supply chain that concerns you the most?
Well, we have all our customers talk about pricing pressures, and it was very, very clear to us at the end of last year that the majority of our customers were not really in a position to accept price increases. So we've done a lot of work behind the scenes to minimise any price increases that we'd have to issue in 2026. Then when this war in the Middle East broke out, pricing just went absolutely haywire. Everybody can see the price of petrol at the service station, and plastics almost follows that trajectory of petrol pricing. And that's put us in that really awkward position of having to say to our customers, we need to charge you more for the products that we supply to you, knowing that they're not really in a position to pay more. And that will force some of them to look offshore to cheaper imported products, which will further erode the base that we have for manufacturing packaging in this country. And sadly, PKN has reported on a number of companies that have shut down or gone out of business in the last few years. And this seems to be a trajectory that's continuing. It doesn't seem to be getting better. And I think we really need to have a very honest and frank conversation to say, what does Australia, what do we want to have? Do we want to be a manufacturing nation? Yes or no? Because if the answer is yes, the actions and the words, they need to start matching up.
Now, in your article that you wrote for PKN, your opinion piece, you compare what's happening here to the decline of Australia's wool industry. What was the key lesson from that experience?
So when I started to look at the history and to write this opinion piece, I started to think about where was Australia's boom coming from after World War II. And that expression that we rode on the sheep's back came up. And when you look about what happened to that wool industry, why is that wool industry nowhere near as strong today as it was back in the 1950s? You can draw a very good comparison to the invention of plastics. We started to see materials that came in which were cheaper, petrochemical based, and they allowed clothing brands and textiles to create new garments. And that led a lot to the decline of wool from our agricultural output and from our economic activity. And you can say that we had a very, very strong industry that started to become weaker due to the advent of plastics. And Australia was well positioned. We had oil, we had gas, we had plants making plastic, we had multiple refineries to process our oil and to create fuel. And we could have been in that position to take advantage of that. And I don't have any belief that we could have been a plastics powerhouse like the Middle East is, for example, but we could have retained some sovereign capabilities. And we've let all that go. And to me, it was really, really interesting to have a look and say that plastics coming into our life and making changes to the structure of our economy, it goes all the way back to 1950s and when wool started to drop away from a percentage of our agricultural output.
Now, you mentioned the closure of plastics manufacturing here, and of course, the closure of Qenos was a major moment for our industry. What did that reveal about the fragility of local manufacturing capability?
Yeah. A few people, including my father, like the expression that you don't know what you don't know. And what we found is that when Qenos closed, we looked for suppliers as close to Australia as we could. And Southeast Asia was an area that we tried to focus on. So we worked to look at sourcing materials out of countries like Thailand. What we didn't know at that time, and which I don't think was widely known, is that yes, the factory that produces the plastics in Thailand is in Southeast Asia, but their dependence on Middle East feedstocks is huge, anywhere between 40 to 60%. So if those plastic plants in Thailand cannot get the feedstock out of the Middle East, they can't supply to us. And that there was a real point of concern when we discovered that out after the war in the Middle East had kicked off. And until the Strait of Hormuz is reopened, until there is some normality returning to the Middle Eastern supply chain, those plants in Southeast Asia are going to continue to struggle to get feedstock. And there are so many moving parts that go into this war in the Middle East that it does. Even if the fighting stopped tomorrow, it doesn't mean that we're going to go back to some sense of normal supply chains. I read an article over the weekend that the Qataris are saying one of their gas fields is damaged. The repair bill will be 20 billion US, and it will take 5 years. And countries like Singapore, for their gas consumption, more than 40% of that came out of Qatar. So the flow-on effects from what we're seeing in the Middle East here, unfortunately, I think we're only at the tip of the iceberg.
Yeah. Now, if we are serious, though, about retaining sovereign capability such as we have it in the local manufacturing sector, what needs to change and who needs to take the lead, Aleks?
Well, I think, again, Australians as a country, all the citizens, we need to have a bit of a think about what do we want to have? What do we want to be a country that we're known for? And government needs to also look at their number one function, which is to look after the safety of their citizens. Now, we talk about steel, we talk about Whyalla and the government bailout that's going in down there. I have no issues with that. I think you can also build a very logical argument that in our daily lives, plastic plays an increasingly important role. Society has been built on plastics since the 1950s, and I would see that to have a sovereign capability for plastics production is crucial. If we just think about what would happen if we get sick, we go to a hospital, we might need to have an intravenous drip bag that's made out of plastic. We might need to have an injection of some sort. That syringe is made out of plastic. If we need to use an antiseptic wash to clean a wound before it's stitched up, that will come in a tube or a bottle or which is manufactured out of plastic. We go to the supermarket after a long day of work, and all the food that we are purchasing, including these ready-to-eat meals, are predominantly or wrapped in plastic. And let's not even think about getting dressed in clothing that doesn't contain plastic. That would even be impossible, basically. And this is where I think the conversation needs to go, that do we recognise that plastic production is a key fundamental block into the lifestyle that we have today? And if the answer to that question is yes, it makes sense that we have sovereign capability to create those blocks here in our own country.
Well, Aleks, thanks for joining us today. The path forward clearly won't be simple. This conversation has to be had at industry and policymaker level, and we will continue to follow it on PKN.
Thank you, Lindy, for talking with me today. And as always, we really appreciate PKN being the voice of our industry and also talking about some of the stories which may not be a pleasant one to discuss.
Thank you.